8. Behavior at meals. The angel who appeared to St. Pachomius instructed him to tell his monks, "While eating they shall cover their heads with their hoods, so that the brother may not see his brother chewing. Nor shall one talk while eating, or cast his eyes anywhere beside his own plate or table." It is evident from the writings of St. John Cassian that the monks of 4th century Egypt heeded this instruction from the angel. For he wrote, "While they are eating with their hoods drawn lower than their eyebrows, lest a free view facilitate a roving curiosity, they can see nothing more than the table and the food that is put on it or taken off of it. The result of this is that no one notices how or how much another person is eating." Elder Emilianos of Simonopetra explained why this was done. The fathers were embarrassed to eat in the presence of others, so they would cover their face. Because of this also, in the monasteries, monks would lower their cowls, not only so that they would not see each other, but also so that they would not speak and fall into temptation. A third reason was so that others would not see them eating. In this way, no one knew if they were eating or how much they were eating. St. Pachomius added, "If anything is needed at table, no one shall dare to speak, but he shall make a sign to the ministers by a sound. When you come out of the meal, you shall not speak while going back to your own place." Nikon of the Black Mountain explained, "It is proper that there be great precision, so that at the refectory table no one speaks any word whatever other than the verse and the lection. For the Divine Fathers say concerning this, the holy sacrificial altar and the brotherhood's table at dinner time are equivalent." Footnote 1006. As for us, however, since the contemporary shape of the cowls of male monastics prevents us from using them as blinds, we can at least preserve the spirit of this rule by making a deliberate effort to keep our eyes from wandering. To continue, St. John Cassian mentioned that the original Egyptian practice was to keep silence at meals without a reading, but the practice advocated by St. Basil the Great of having one monk read to the others during meals prevailed as monasticism developed. St. Simeon the New Theologian advised how to behave at meals as follows, quote, "When you've begun to eat together with your fathers and brethren, take heed to yourself. Sit in total recollection and silence without talking to anyone at all, but pay attention to the reading, and so be nourished in soul, no less than in body, for the inspired utterances of the Spirit. Since you have a twofold being that is composed of soul and body, you must likewise have twofold nourishment. Do not be curious about the portions that are set before you on the table, which happens to be larger or smaller, but accept with all thankfulness the amount that is given to you. But eat it with restraint. In all respects avoid satiety, considering yourself to be unworthy of the common table of the brethren." End quote. St. Benedict taught, "Let the deepest silence be maintained during meals, that no whisper or voice be heard, except that of the reader alone. But let the brethren so help each other to what is needed for eating and drinking, that no one need ask for anything. If, however, anything should be wanted, let it be asked for by means of a sign of any kind rather than a sound. And let no one presume to ask any questions there, either about the book or anything else, in order that no cause to speak be given to the devil." See Ephesians 4, verse 27, 1 Timothy 5, verse 14. Unless perchance the superior wishes to say a few words for edification. St. Sophrony did of Essex just this, for he used to interrupt the reading during meals and comment on what was read. At times of particular inspiration, he would continue speaking for hours until the next meal. The rule of the master suggested that during the meal the abbot should ask the fathers questions about what was just read in order to make sure that they are paying attention. Footnote 1015. While the rule is being read during the meal, let the abbot, in order to stimulate carefully listening by all the brothers, ask any of the brothers at any of the tables as he pleases what was read. When one of the brethren repeats what he heard, therefore it will be evident that he was at that time paying closer attention to the reading than to his stomach. And when one deaf through negligence does not tell what he heard, The presumption will be that he loved the flesh more than the spirit. He must be scolded by his abbot then, and rightly so for his inattention. So each and every brother, afraid of being embarrassed, should be questioned, will not let his mind wander elsewhere, but pay attention to what is being read. The rule of Calla, written in 8th century Ireland, however, recommends that they should be questioned the following day. The rule of the master advises, the reader shall read in an orderly way, taking his time, so that the hearers, though occupied, may clearly recognize what it is they have to fulfill in their deeds. Saint Athanasius I, the Patriarch of Constantinople, wrote in his monastic rules, "Let neither the superior nor any other brother leave the table except for a compelling reason. Let both the superior himself and all others have the same bread and wine and cooked food. No one should talk at table, but all should pay attention to the readings and delight in the enlightenment from this reading. They should also gratefully glorify God, the provider of the food." Saint Ephrem the Syrian said, "Are you sitting at the table to eat? Be attentive to yourself, and do not look right and left like an ill-mannered person. A monk who eats the whole pieces of food instead of the leftovers is lacking in manners. Do not disdain leftovers, for the Lord told his disciples to gather up the fragments that were left over, lest anything should be lost." Matthew 14, verse 20. He who does not talk during mealtimes is like one who eats his bread with honey. Similarly, Abba Isaiah taught, "When you sit at table with brothers, stretch out your hand only to the area immediately before you. But if something lies in front of another person, do not reach out to it. Your knees should be held firmly together. When you are eating, do not raise your head toward your neighbor, nor look here or there, and do not speak unnecessarily." Footnote 1020 on Abba Isaiah of Scetis. Euronissa Macrina wrote almost the same advice for her nuns. "We should go to the refectory immediately when the samandran strikes. During the meal, there must be absolute silence. Hesychia. Our feet should be together, and we should not look at other people's plates. As soon as we have finished eating, we should not look around with curiosity, but should lower our heads with reverence and the fear of God." A mistake sometimes made by monastics is to complain about the food. Saint Ephrem the Syrian advises us, "Do not be thankful just today for the food on your table. Indeed, if tomorrow the food is not to your liking, do not murmur against the cook or the one responsible for the refectory." The rule of Paul and Stephen says, "Let us accept God's gift of food with no quarreling, no murmuring or resentment." Likewise, Abba Isaac said, "He who at table chatters, laughs, or reviles the food has withdrawn from God, and God has withdrawn from him." And Abba Isaiah taught, "If a brother cooks something, and it does not turn out well, do not say to him, 'You have cooked badly,' as this will mean death for your soul. But examine yourself, thinking that had you heard this from someone else, you would feel very sad, and then you will find rest." It goes without saying that monastics strictly follow all the appointed fasts of the Church. In addition to fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, monastics fast on Mondays as well, in honor of the angels whom they strive to imitate. The canons of the Church prohibit olive oil on fasting days, but they do not mention whether or not other oils are allowed. Footnote 1025, for example, St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain wrote in his interpretation of the 69th Apostolic Canon, quote, "Fasting on every Wednesday and Friday ought to be done by eating dry bread, in a similar manner as in the case of Lent. Eating dry bread is the eating of bread once a day at the 9th hour without eating olive oil or drinking wine." From Agapios and Nicodemus the Rudder, page 125. To continue. Elder Ephrem held the opinion that other vegetable oils are generally to be avoided on fasting days, although he would frequently make exceptions and allow them. He also taught that it is not necessary to check the ingredients of a food that is usually allowed during a fast, such as a bread, before eating it. If, however, we are aware that a food that is usually allowed during a fast does contain non-fasting ingredients, such as dairy products, then he said we should not eat it during a fast. As for dietary supplements, such as fish oil capsules or protein powders containing egg, He believed that such things may be consumed even during a fast if taken for health reasons. St. Simeon the New Theologian emphasized how beneficial fasting is. From his discourses, quote, "Let each one of us keep in mind the benefit of fasting, and what gifts from God he has enjoyed in these few fasting days, and so become more eager for the days to come. For this healer of our souls is effective in the case of one to quiet the fevers and impulses of the flesh, in another to assuage bad temper, in yet another to drive away sleep, in another to stir up zeal, and in yet another to restore purity of mind and to set him free from evil thoughts. In one it will control his unbridled tongue, and as it were, by a bit, restrain it by the fear of God and prevent it from uttering idle or corrupt words. In another it will invisibly guard his eyes and fix them on high instead of allowing them to roam hither and thither, and thus cause him to look on himself and teach him to be mindful of his own faults and shortcomings. Fasting gradually disperses and drives away spiritual darkness and the veil of sin that lies on the soul, just as the sun dispels the mist. Fasting enables us spiritually to see that spiritual air in which Christ, the sun who knows no setting, does not rise, but shines without ceasing. Fasting, aided by vigil, penetrates and softens hardness of heart. Where once were the vapors of drunkenness, it causes fountains of compunction to spring forth. I beseech you, brethren, let each of us strive that this may happen in us." End of quote. Discourses of Simeon the New Theologian. Many other saints also praised the value of fasting. St. Photius the Great wrote, "Fasting is a medicine that cleanses the passions." Abba Hyperchios said, "Fasting is a check against sin for the monk. He who discards it is like a rampaging stallion." See Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 8. Taken from the sayings of the Desert Fathers. St. Nilos the ascetic wrote, "The bread of fasting is good because it is free of the leaven of pleasures." St. Isaac the Syrian said, "A mourner," in Syriac this word is also used to denote a monk, "is he who passes all the days of his life in hunger and thirst for the sake of his hope in good things to come." That he would do extra Lents, in addition to Great Lent, by eating only food without oil for 40 consecutive days. More on that, see My Elder Joseph the Hesychist, page 156, written by Elder Ephraim. St. Paisius of the Holy Mountain commented, "In the old days our Holy Fathers greatly preferred food without oil and lengthy fasts, and this is why they had sanctity and physical health and strength. On the contrary, nowadays, with the hyper-consumerism in foods and their variety, their quantity, the sanctity of monks has decreased and their physical and spiritual illnesses have increased." St. Nectarius of Aegina wrote to the abbess of his monastery, "The female body was made to have greater needs because it was intended to tire more quickly. For this reason, women who want to emulate the diet of men tire quickly. A woman has a natural need for more food and more sleep. Remember that you are a woman, and do not try to rival men." Since the tongue is strengthened by an abundance of food. According to St. John of Sinai, the author of the Ladder of Divine Ascent, the Holy Fathers warned against excessive talking after a meal. Abba Isaiah said, "When the office concludes or when you rise from the meal table, do not delay one another by speaking either about God or about the world, but let each one of you enter his own cell and weep for his sins. If it is necessary to speak to each other, converse only a very little with humility and respect, as if God was listening to you." Likewise, St. Lazarus of Mount Gelasion said that after church or the meal we should, quote, "go straight to our cell, not clustering together to spend time in idle talk, not sitting, drinking, and eating together, not leaving our cells out of listlessness, akadia, and going to the cells of others, unless it should be necessary, but rather remaining steadfastly in our own cell. Lest he, St. Lazarus, would say, leaving our own cells and going off to those of the others, we should see or hear or say things we would rather not. For this is what leads to words. In this way we come to judge our brothers. and abuse them, till the blinded soul loses her way and strays from the right goal. We give up looking at ourselves to gossip about the faults of others, unable to stop ourselves or recognize our own weaknesses. We begin bandying insults and quarreling and daily provoking scandals with the brothers. 9. Punctuality. It is important that monks come on time to church and meals, not only for the sake of order and for not scandalizing laymen, but even for the inherent spiritual benefit. Abba Dorotheus related an incident about an elder who saw an angel setting a holy seal on the brethren in church. Quote, "The man in bright raiments said to him, 'I am an angel of the Lord, and I have been given a command to seal with the sign of the Holy Cross all those who are in church from the beginning of the service on account of their eagerness, diligence, and good intentions.' The elder replied, saying, 'Why then do you make the sign of the cross over the place of some of those who are missing?' The holy angel answered him, 'Those brothers who are diligent and of good intention, but out of some need or illness are missing with the blessing of their spiritual father, or who, in obedience to some command or task, are busy somewhere else, and not in attendance for that reason, these, despite their absence, I seal with the sign of the cross, since in spirit they are with those who are chanting the service, only those who would otherwise be able to be present, but because of their laziness are absent, am I commanded not to seal with the sign of the cross, for they are made unworthy thereof by their own actions." End of quote. Some monastic canons assign punishments to those who come late to the services. For example, St. Lazarus of Mount Galician ordered that to those who did not arrive for the service at the beginning of the matins, the cellarer should not supply the portion of wine allotted to them, or even sometimes food. And St. Caesarius of Arles wrote, "She who comes late after the signal has been given to office or to work will be subject to rebuke as is fitting. If, after a second or a third admonition, she does not correct the fault, she should be withdrawn from communal life and from the common meal." 10. Silence. Hesychia. Antioch, the author of the Pendex, concisely declared the reason for monastic silence. A monk should say many things to God, but few to men. For immoderate loquacity, which distracts the mind, not only makes him idle with regard to spiritual work, but also surrenders him to the demon of listlessness. St. Ephrem the Syrian observed, "He who speaks much among brethren will be hated, whereas he who keeps a watch over his mouth will be loved." St. Diodokos Photiki taught, "Just as when the doors of the baths are left continually open, the heat inside is quickly driven out, so also the soul, when it wishes to say many things, even though everything that it says may be good, disperses its concentration through the door of the voice." Moreover, Christ himself warns us of the danger of idle talk. Quote, "Every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment." Matthew 12:36. Abba Arsenios remarked, "I have often repented of having spoken, but never of having been silent." St. Benedict wrote, "The 11th degree of humility is that when a monk speaketh, he speaks gently and without laughter, humbly, and with gravity, with few and sensible words, and that he be not loud of voice, as it is written, the wise man is known by the fewness of his words." The rule of St. Abel states, 2/3 of piety consists in being silent. St. Sophronia of Essex observed, "When someone talks a lot, he becomes spiritually weak." Elder Milianos taught his monks, "Silence characterizes a man of God, for within silence is God and prayer. Speaking and discussions are a departure from our true state." St. Basil the Great saw silence as especially beneficial for novices. He wrote, "The practice of silence is beneficial for novices, for if they control the tongue, they will both give sufficient proof of continence and will learn in quiet, eagerly, and attentively from those that are skilled in instruction how they must ask questions and answer each individual question. For there is a tone of voice, a moderateness of length, a propriety of time and a specific appropriateness in the use of words which are especially characteristic of those leading the devout life. And these qualities cannot be taught to one who has not acquired them by constant practice. By reason of its restful quiet, silence induces forgetfulness of the past and affords leisure to learn good habits. Consequently, silence should be kept, except, of course, for the chanting of the psalms, unless some private need pertaining to the care of one's soul or an emergency in the task at hand should arise, or some similar question require an answer. There are numerous examples from the lives of the saints who took the matter of silence after church services very seriously. For example, Abba Macarius the Great said to the brothers at Scetis, when he dismissed the assembly, "Flee, my brothers." One of the old men asked him, "Where could we flee beyond this desert?" He placed his finger on his lips and said, "Flee that." And he went into his cell, shut the door, and sat down. The 4th century regulations of Horsiosos commanded, "When the synaxis is dismissed, let us recite prayers until we reach our houses. Let no one speak to his neighbor as he leaves the synaxis, even for matters that relate to the community." Likewise, St. John Cassian wrote, "When the psalms are finished, then, and the daily gathering has broken up, none of them dares to linger or to chat for a while with anyone else." And St. Simeon the New Theologian taught, quote, "Once the morning office of praise is finished, do not, as soon as you've left the church, start talking to one man and then the other, and so be distracted in idle talk. If on your way back to your cell you see a brother by himself or sitting down with others and chatting outside the time, make a reverence and pass in silence. Do not go to sit with them, but be mindful of the psalmist saying, 'Blessed is the man that hath not walked in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stood in the way of sinners, and hath not sat in the seat of the scornful.'" Psalm 1:1. For such people are a plague, as Paul says. Bad company ruins good morals. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. If a plague is anything, so is also corruption. Do not then, beloved, sit with those who talk idly, and do not say, "I too want to hear what you're saying." But as I have said, make a reverence, and pass by. Observe silence and solitude. Silence by saying to yourself, "What good have I to say, who am altogether mud and a fool? Besides, I'm a stranger, and unworthy to speak and listen to be numbered among men." In his commentary on James, chapter 1, verse 19, "Let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak," St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain included the following patristic teachings. Abba Nestherios said to Abba Joseph, "Be silent, and when a conversation takes place, it is better to listen than to speak." And a wise man once said, "We have 2 ears, but 1 tongue, so that we would listen more than we speak." Likewise, St. Basil the Great, in his book on virginity, said, "Since nature took into account the necessary ratio of listening to speaking, it provided for us 2 ears and 1 tongue, since we should listen to instruction twice as much as we speak." The author of Ecclesiastes said, "A fool multiplies words." St. John of Carpathos also mentions this verse of James as follows, "A single unbecoming word prevented Moses from entering the promised land." We should not suppose, then, that talkativeness is only a minor disease. Lovers of slander and gossip shut themselves out from the kingdom of heaven. A wise man said well, "Better to slip from a height to the ground than to slip with your tongue." One method used by the Holy Fathers to facilitate more silence was to avoid close proximity with others when walking. For example, they used to say about Abba Amios that when he was on his way to church, he would not allow his disciple to walk very close to him, but at a distance. And if he came to ask him about his logismi, his thoughts, no sooner did he speak to him than he would immediately chase him away, saying, "I do not let you be very close to me, in case some alien discourse should raise its head while we are speaking of spiritual benefit." Similarly, St. Joseph the Hesychist, Papu, would not allow Father Arsenios to walk near him when traveling, but they intentionally remained apart, in order to keep the prayer and to avoid talking. Saint Caesarius of Arles wrote in his rule for nuns how to work with silence. They shall do their work. They shall not busy themselves with idle talk, according to that saying of the holy apostle, that they work quietly. And another saying, in much speaking you will not avoid sin. 2 Thessalonians 3:12 and Proverbs 10:19. And therefore you must speak entirely of that which pertains to the edification and usefulness of the soul. When, however, the necessity of the work requires it, then they may speak. While the rest are working together, one of the sisters shall read until 3 hours after dawn. Moreover, let not meditation on the word of God and the prayer of the heart cease. Likewise, St. Fructucus of Braga wrote in his rule for the monastery of Compludo, while they work, they are not to exchange stories or pleasantries or jokes, but as they work they shall quietly meditate, each to himself. St. John of Sinai taught in the Ladder of Divine Ascent, let us practice extreme silence and ignorance in the presence of the superior, for a silent man is a son of philosophy, always acquiring much knowledge. I have seen a monastic who used to snatch the words from his superior's lips. He interrupted him, but I despaired of his living in submission when I saw this led to pride and not to humility. Elder Emilianos described the true spirit of Hesychia in silence in the Regulations of the Holy Cenobium of the Annunciation, or Emilia, Greece. Quote, from the Authentic Seal, page 179. In all places within the cenobium, quietude shall naturally be sought, since it is proper to monastics to live for God alone and to occupy their minds with the most divine matters in quietude. In appropriate places, the nuns may converse for company and edification, or may sing hymns in seemly freedom under the eye of the Lord, who is everywhere present. A stultifying and timorous atmosphere shall not prevail, but rather one of seemly and legitimate freedom. The conversation shall not, however, turn to worldly things. It shall be seasoned with salt, Colossians 4:6, conducted in all refinement and courtesy, turning to things of good report and pure, Philippians 4:8, and befitting monastics. During the hours of the night, however, all encounters shall be avoided, and at all times any discussion shall be avoided which is pointless, chatty, or gossipy. It shall be a profound inner conviction that the whole of our life together in its everyday reality, beyond its visible aspects, shall be called holy, a convocation and assembly together with the choirs of the angels. End of quote Emilianos. Elder Emilianos elaborated more on the value of silence to his monks. Quote, during times of work, the Holy Fathers would keep silent. Thus, we keep silent in trapeza and at work. We say only things we've read in the Gospel that God has told us to say and what our work requires us to say. Perhaps someone will object, won't we suffer boredom with silence? On the contrary, it is with words that we suffer boredom, because they're always the same, because we wound people, and we as a body fall apart. Another illness is talking a lot while working. Undoubtedly, when something is done with a discussion, perhaps something good will happen, but never something perfect, because it is not an acceptable sacrifice to God. It is a work and labor that does not bear divine fruit, so we do not obtain a treasure in heaven. Only with silence does work become an acceptable sacrifice to God. Our words are an indication of our individualism, our thoughts, our ideas, our knowledge, and ideologies. They reveal that we are just a number in the world and not a member of the body of Christ. If we examine our discussions, we will see that we do not say anything that results from tears in prayer and in our vigil, nothing that is a revelation of the Lord. We say whatever our own individualism hides. But even if we say something spiritual, even then one can find the seeds of our individualism. Keeping silence is of no use if inwardly one is judging. As Abba Pimon said, someone may seem to be silent, but if in the heart one is condemning others, then one is babbling ceaselessly. There may be another who talks from morning till evening, and yet in the heart that person is truly silent. That person says nothing that is not profitable. Elder Ephraim once observed sadly, "Nowadays the sin of judging is as common as bread and cheese." That is very prevalent. 11. Mutual respect. Evagrius the Solitary expressed the ideals of monastic brotherly love as follows, quote, "Blessed is the monk who regards every man as God after God. Blessed is the monk who sees everyone's salvation and progress with great joy, as if they were his own. A monk is he who is separated from all and united with all. A monk is he who regards himself as linked with every man, though always seeing himself in each person." End of quote. Philokalia, Volume 1, pages 68 and following, Evagrius the Solitary. One way to show respect is to address others with their appropriate title. Yoronda Samakrina wrote to her nuns, quote, "When we address one another, the word sister must precede the name. For example, Sister Eleni. This is essentially the same as what St. Benedict wrote. In naming each other, let no one be allowed to address another by his simple name, but let the older style the younger brethren brothers, and let the younger, however, call their elders fathers, by which is implied the reverence due to a father." Similarly, St. Chorgan wrote in his rule, in addressing each other, it is not permitted for any of them to address another by his name only, but according to Roman custom, he shall call him by his name first, and then add the distinction of his rank. Thus one says, Leovine, prior; Wolfstan, precentor; Berthelhem, deacon; Sinward, sexton, and so forth, and so with everybody. The reason for these rules was to encourage mutual respect when dealing with the other members of the holy monastery. In Athonite monasteries, novices are not addressed with the title brother, but are simply called by their name, because they have no tonsure and are therefore still laymen for all practical purposes. The tonsured monks, however, are called Father so-and-so by their fellow monks. In one of his homilies at Philotheu Monastery, Elder Ephraim sharply denounced the practice of some monks who were using nicknames for other monks. St. Donatus of Besnacan would have agreed with avoiding this kind of familiarity, since he wrote in his rules for nuns, "Any who is called little sister, or who call one another little sister, is to be punished with 40 blows if they so transgress." St. Sophronia of Essex told his monastics, "Respect every member of this monastic family as a gift from our Heavenly Father, and pray for each one every day, in the morning and in the evening before you go to sleep at night. If God grants us love for everyone within our monastic community, this way we will be able to inspire also those who come to us. If we lack love amongst us, how will we be able to preach love to others?" The gift of loving in a manner that is heavenly, godly, and eternal does not come easily. It comes through the lamentations of the evening, of the night, when we're alone. End of quote, St. Sophronie. St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain also highlighted how critical it is not to lack love. He wrote, "Monasticism requires that monks have meekness and tranquility of heart. If you do not eradicate hatred from your heart and plant love instead, and if you do not stop speaking evil of your brethren, know that, and excuse me for my boldness, in vain you are dwelling in the mountains and hills. In vain are all your ascetic struggles and labors and sweat. Should we say what is even greater? Even if you were to undergo martyrdom for the sake of Christ, your martyrdom would be in vain if you have hatred." End of quote. An important way of showing respect is to listen sincerely to what the other person's trying to tell us. As Stephen Covey observed, "If I were to summarize in one sentence the most single important principle I've learned in the field of interpersonal relations, it would be this: seek first to understand, then to be understood." This involves a very deep shift in paradigm. We typically seek first to be understood. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen only with the intent to reply. They're either speaking or preparing to speak. It is worth noting that Covey found this maxim of seeking first to understand to be the most difficult principle to live. He admitted, quote, "When I am really tired and already convinced I'm right, I really don't want to listen. I may even pretend to listen." The essence of this pitfall consists in a shift of one's intent from wanting to connect with the other person to wanting to prove what is right. And I, most of us think, am certainly the one who is right. Therefore, if we want people to listen to us, no matter how right we believe we are, we should bear in mind Theodore Roosevelt's astute insight. Quote, "Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care." For even if we are in fact right, human nature makes the other person much more willing to accept our words and change it if he knows that we care enough to listen to him. Another challenging form of respect is to maintain brotherly love even towards someone who is not present at a conversation that is critical of him. As Stephen Covey put it, quote, "One of the most important ways to manifest integrity is to be loyal to those who are not present. In doing so, we build the trust of those who are present. When you defend those who are absent, you retain the trust of those present." End of quote. As a way to implement this, he suggested, "Assume everything you say about another they can overhear. Now speak accordingly." Footnote. From the following words of St. Sophronia of Essex, it is evident that he managed to follow this difficult principle in his life. Quote, "Even if, for example, the abbot were in the same place where I was hearing the confession of his monks, behind a curtain, and heard what I was saying when someone complained about him, he would not find anything inappropriate in my words." Covey elaborated on this point by giving the following examples. Quote, "Suppose you and I were talking alone, and we were criticizing our superior or supervisor in a way that we would not dare to do if he were present. Now, what will happen when you and I have a falling out? You know I'm going to be discussing your weaknesses with someone else. That's what you and I did behind our supervisor's back. You know my nature. I'll sweet-talk you to your face and bad-mouth you behind your back. You've seen me do it. That's the essence of duplicity. Does that build a reserve of trust in my account with you? On the other hand, suppose you were to start criticizing our supervisor, and I basically told you I agree with the content of some of the criticism and suggest that the two of us go directly to him and make an effective presentation on how things might be improved. Then what would you know if I would do if someone were to criticize you to me behind your back? For another example, suppose in my effort to build a relationship with you, I told you something someone else had shared with me in confidence. I really shouldn't tell you this, I might say, but since you're my friend, and so forth. Would my betraying another person build my trust account with you? Or would you wonder if the things you had told me in confidence were being shared with others? Such duplicity might appear to be making a deposit with the person you're with, but it is actually a withdrawal because you communicate your own lack of integrity. End of quote. Footnote, Covey is referring to his concept of an emotional bank account, which he explains as follows. It is like a financial bank account into which you make deposits and take out withdrawals, only in this case you make emotional deposits and withdrawals in your relationships that either build or destroy them. To continue, rather than criticizing someone or complaining to him, the loftiest path would be to refrain from expressing one's displeasure, while forgiving him with love and blaming oneself with humility. When, however, we lack the love and humility to do so wholeheartedly, then trying to suppress one's displeasure often leads to coldness and resentment. An effective way of avoiding this pitfall is to implement nonviolent communication. In our attempts to show brotherly love to one another, caution is necessary that we not show preferential love to those who have a more likable character. St. Basil the Great, in his ascetical works, Volume 9, states, quote, "Since they, the monks, are clearly obliged to love one another with an equal measure of affection, exclusive groups and factions are detrimental to the community. For he who loves one more than the others betrays his lack of perfect love for the others. Likewise, both unseemly strife and particular affection should be banished from the monastery. For enmity is engendered by strife, And from particular friendship and factions arise suspicions and jealousies. In every instance, the loss of equality is the origin and foundation of envy and hatred on the part of those who are slighted thereby. Therefore we have received the commandment from the Lord to imitate the goodness of him who maketh the sun to rise upon the just and the unjust. Matthew 5:45. As then God grants a share of light impartially to all, so let those who imitate God send forth a ray of love equally brilliant for all alike. For wherever love falls short, hatred entirely supplants it. The love of all toward all, therefore, should be equal and impartial. What can we compare with this monastic way of life? What is more blessed? What is more genuine than connection and unity? People from various races and countries have come and united themselves with such precision that one soul is seen in many bodies, and the many bodies appear as the members of one opinion. They are each other's equal servants and each other's masters, because love makes them subject themselves to each other, and it assures freedom through their personal volition. The brethren should betray no sign of anger, of unforgiveness or envy or contentiousness, whether in bearing or gesture or word or glance of the eye, expression of the countenance, or by anything calculated to arouse a companion's ire. End quote. Basil the Great. St. Nectarius of Aegina also wrote about the danger of partial friendships, which he understood as an expression of love that is not divine, that is rooted in Christ, but human. He warns his nuns in a letter to them. Quote from the St. Nectarius of Pentapolis and the island of Aegina, volume 2. Quote, your love toward me should not come about as the result of thought or because of my love for you, but it should be an overflowing of the love of the Lord. That is, it should flow from our common bond of love. This love is a pure kind of love in spirit, which the evil one is unable to exploit or deviously try to change little by little into a commonplace human love. When this latter sort of love builds up in only one of the persons, it produces hate in the other person, the one being loved. When it builds up in both persons, it produces romantic love. For this reason, when we show love toward others, whether they be of the same gender or the opposite gender, but especially those whom we might be capable of loving romantically, we ought to examine our relationships daily, lest our love does not proceed from Christ's bond of love and does not overflow from the fullness of love. He who is vigilant with his love and preserves it pure and unadulterated by human things is also protected from the traps of the evil one, who endeavors to inspire human love toward those whom we love and then to change it into romantic love. And he deceives in their sleep people who love each other with a human love. And when a person connected to the love of the Lord loathes a person who loves him humanly, the evil one makes him seem to have a heart wounded by romantic love. Therefore, you must have great caution with the love you have for one another, and for me as well, and for everyone else, so that you're not ensnared by the evil one. End of quote, St. Nectarius. Contemporary sociologists have observed that what is most detrimental to a long-term relationship is not arguing in itself, but the way two people argue. Their observations were made in the context of married couples, and therefore we monastics ought to question to what degree these findings can be applied to the relationship a monk has with his elder or his fellow monks. In our opinion, most of their findings do apply to all relationships due to the commonality of human nature, and therefore we monastics can glean insights from their studies. One group of researchers explained as follows the behaviors that are the most detrimental to relationships. Quote, the relationship scholar Howard Markman learned that by focusing on only a few behaviors, he could predict with startling accuracy whether a given married couple is headed for divorce. Most importantly, he found that if he could help couples practice a few similarly critical behaviors, he could reduce their chances of divorce or unhappiness by over 1/3. You don't have to study what interests the couple share in common, or how they were raised, or any of the 1,000 different ways they treat each other. Merely watch how they argue. If Markman and his colleagues can watch a couple for just 15 minutes, they can predict with 90% accuracy who will and who won't be together and happy 5 years later. During those 15 minutes, Markman will invite a couple to discuss some topic about which they disagree. If the argument involves a significant amount of blaming, escalation, invalidation, or withdrawal, the future is bleak. If, on the other hand, the same couple opens tough conversations with statements that communicate respect and shared purpose, and halts emotional escalation in a respectful way to take a time out, the future will be entirely different. End of quote from Patterson, Grenny, and Maxfield, and Macmillan, and Switzler in a book titled Influencer, The Power to Change Anything, McGraw-Hill, 2008. To continue, the same group of researchers found that the four most damaging behaviors in an argument are criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. Commenting on this, they wrote, quote, criticism, defensiveness, and contempt could be considered forms of psychological violence and, quite frankly, seem to be rather obvious predictors of dissatisfaction. It's hard to attack one another and remain satisfied with a relationship. In contrast, stonewalling is a form of silence and could easily be seen as less important, but that would be wrong. Silence is actually a powerful predictor of dissatisfaction. Related research shows that only 40% of divorces are caused by frequent and ferocious fights. Instead of going at it vociferously, couples learn to avoid skirmishes by avoiding each other. Over time, their friendship fades, the relationship withers. This footnote from the book Change Anything, also Patterson, Grenny, Maxfield, Macmillan, and Switzer. Furthermore, the same group of researchers also found what words and actions help a relationship. Quote, small actions can have a large positive impact. For example, University of Utah psychology professor Timothy Smith recruited 150 couples with an average marriage tenure of 36 years. He asked these seasoned couples to discuss a topic they had a difficult time resolving. Many launched into stressful exchanges about chores or spending, but some couples did little things that others didn't. Even as the talking heated up, there would be occasional expressions of warmth. At times, it could just be a tiny term of endearment tacked onto the beginning of an expression of frustration, like, "Sweetheart, I can't understand a word you're saying." Smith discovered not only that these little gestures profoundly related to happiness with the relationship, but also that their presence related to substantial decreases in heart disease as well. End of quote. Thus, if the married couple is able to express themselves to each other lovingly, even during a disagreement, the likelihood of divorce is very low. Even without explicitly using terms of endearment, an inner disposition of brotherly love will naturally reveal itself through one's tone of voice and body language, which constitute 93% of actual communication. Footnote, studies have shown that spoken words account for only 7% of the meaning people derive from conversations pertaining to feelings or attitudes. Paralinguistic information, that is, prosody, pitch, volume, intonation, speed, etc., accounts for 38%. The majority of meaning, 55%, comes from unspoken information. When this nonverbal information, also known as body language, conflicts with words, listeners will typically pay more attention to the speaker's body language. Research done in a book, Nonverbal Communication. To continue. As the colorful Greek saying goes, love and a cough cannot be hidden. Showing respect to others is not merely a matter of words and deeds, but even of thoughts. As St. Sophronia of Essex warned his monastics, quote, Every time you're in your cell, or wherever, and you're thinking in a disparaging way towards your brothers or sisters, you are destroying life. And the brothers or sisters whom you're criticizing feel it and are wounded. How does this happen? Even between those who do not pray, there is a psychological sensitivity, and they perceive the psychic waves, the psychic energy that others are emitting. No one notices anything. He doesn't hear any words. He doesn't see any gestures. That which happens, happens in secret, yet life is destroyed. If someone, I won't stop repeating this, allows himself to have bad thoughts about somebody else, this destroys life, because everyone has in his heart an innate perception that enables him to feel what others have within themselves. Every thought, positive or negative, even when we are alone in our cell, is an energy and a power that is reflected in the life of the whole monastery. When thoughts are positive, when prayer is fervent, of one for another, and of one for all, and of all for one, then the walls of the monastery are strengthened. On the contrary, however, when our thoughts take a turn for the worse, and instead of loving, we criticize our brother, then this makes cracks in the walls of the monastery, and everything falls apart. End of quote. Sophrony of Essex. A crucial factor for the health of a community is its unity. St. Basil the Great observed, whenever a group of men aiming at the same goal of salvation adopt the life in common, this principle above all must prevail among them, that there be in all one heart, one will, one desire, and that the entire community be, as the Holy Apostle enjoins, one body consisting of divers members. 1 Corinthians 12:12. This is why St. Theodore the Studite exclaimed, "What a good thing peace and oneness of mind are for a community." In the same spirit, St. Athanasius of Athos wrote, "Although the entire fullness of the community is joined together from diverse links, they form one heart in their common life, one will, one desire, and one body, as the Apostle prescribes." Unity within a monastery is so important that St. Benedict Biscop urged his disciples on his deathbed to preserve peace, unity, and concord of the society. Venerable Bede added to this, taken from the lives of the abbots of Wearmouth, Benedict, Sealfrid, Easterwine, and Hubert, London, published in 1818. Quote, in proof of the importance of this, he, St. Benedict, would repeatedly instance the kingdom of Israel, ever uninvaded and invincible to foreign nations, whilst united under the banners of one of its native generals, but no sooner disunited in punishment of the sins of its inhabitants, by domestic broils and rival contests, than it was shaken to its foundation, and speedily fell down in ruins. To this also he would often add the known warning given in the text of the Gospel, "Every kingdom divided against itself shall be made desolate." Matthew 12, verse 25. In order to preserve peace and order in the monastery, monastics need to accept corrections humbly. St. Cesarius of Arles instructed his nuns, "She who is admonished, chastised, corrected, for any fault whatever, shall not answer in any way to the one accusing." Similarly, the rule of Tarn states, "Let it be judged wrong to answer back when blamed, even with a sharp rebuke, for any fault. But by humbling himself, let him be taught to continue correcting the fault, because God has promised in return that he will give grace to the humble." More, see Proverbs 3, verse 34. In the same spirit, St. Joseph the Hesychist taught that proper speech for a monk is to say only eυλόγησον, and may it be blessed. Nine ευλογημένον. In other words, when he makes a mistake and is corrected, he should not make thousands of excuses, but simply say ευλόγησον, that is, forgive me. And when someone tells him to do something that cuts off his will, he should humbly give in and say, may it be blessed. As St. Columbanus put it, no matter how distasteful the command imposed on him may be, he shall always say to his superior, "Not as I will, but as thou wilt." Matthew 26:39. After the example of our Savior, who says elsewhere, I came down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him that sent me. John 6:38. Another aspect of traditional monastic speech that Elder Ephraim taught us is when one's name is called, to answer with evlogoson, which roughly corresponds in English to bless or pardon, rather than saying what or yes. The following incident shows that the Desert Fathers also emphasized courtesy in speech. One day Abba Theodore was entertaining himself with the brethren. While they were eating, they drank their cups with respect, but in silence, without even saying evlogoson or pardon. So Abba Theodore said, the monks have lost their manners and do not even say pardon. 12. Communication. St. Basil attached great importance to the way we speak. He wrote, quote, from his letters and selected works, letter number 2, most importantly, one should endeavor not to be ignorant how to converse, but should know how to ask questions in a non-argumentative manner, to answer without desire of display, not to interrupt someone when he is saying something profitable, or to desire to put in a word of one's own in order to show off, to be balanced in speaking and hearing, not to be ashamed of learning, or to be grudging in giving information, nor to pass another's knowledge for one's own, but to refer it candidly to the true parent. The middle tone of voice is best, neither so quiet as to be inaudible, nor to be tiresome from its loud volume. One should reflect first what one is going to say, and then give it utterance. Be courteous when addressed, amiable in social intercourse, not aiming to be pleasant through joking, but cultivating gentleness and kind admonitions. St. Columbanus presented the following ideal of humble communication in a monastery, quote, he who has replied to a brother on his pointing something out, it is not as you say, except for seniors, speaking honestly to juniors, shall be punished with an imposition of silence or 50 blows, unless this only be allowed that he should reply to his brother of equal standing, if there's something nearer the truth than what the others say, and he remembers it. Like, if you recollect rightly, my brother, and the other, on hearing this, does not repeat his assertion, but humbly says, I trust that you remember better. I have erred in speech by forgetfulness, and I am sorry that I said ill. These are the words of the sons of God. If nothing be in contention nor in vainglory, but in lowliness of spirit, each reckoning the other better than himself. Philippians 2:3. But let him who has justified himself be considered not a spiritual son of God, but a carnal son of Adam. 13. Nonviolent communication. Nonviolent communication refers to a method of communicating developed by Marshall Rosenberg and presented in his book Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life. In this section, we shall attempt to summarize his most helpful insights. We believe that his method is worth including in a book on monastic life, because our experience has shown that the vast majority of interpersonal conflicts in a monastery, or anywhere for that matter, can be averted or resolved through this method. Moreover, it provides tools for acquiring greater self-awareness. A core principle of nonviolent communication, originally named compassionate communication. Footnote, Rosenberg has said that he regrets the choice of the term nonviolent because it is often misunderstood in Western culture. He said that he had chosen this term, quote, to refer to our natural state of compassion when violence has subsided from the heart. While we may not consider the way we talk to be, quote, violent, our words do often lead to hurt and to pain, whether for others or ourselves. To continue. Originally named compassionate communication is that all human behavior stems from attempts to meet needs, which are universally shared by all human beings, regardless of their background, their gender, upbringing, or culture. Understanding and acknowledging these fundamental human needs creates a shared basis for empathetic connection, cooperation, and harmonious relationships. Fundamental needs are never in conflict, but conflict arises when someone has adopted a specific strategy for meeting some of his needs, which does not meet the needs of others, and when he has not considered other strategies that would meet everyone's needs. Nonviolent communication, NVC, proposes that if people can identify their needs, the needs of others, and the feelings that surround these needs, harmony can be achieved. Rosenberg found that the most effective way of meeting everyone's needs while maintaining love, peace, and honesty in a dialogue is to express oneself using the following 4 components of observation, feeling, need, and request. 1. Make a factual, specific, and neutral observation devoid of evaluation and judgment. 2. Honestly reveal what inner feelings I have in connection with that observation. Or, if the focus is on the other person, guess what the other person is feeling and ask to verify your guess. 3. Identify the universal need triggering that feeling of mine. Or, if the focus is on the other person, guess which need triggered a feeling in the other person and verify your guess. 4. Make a specific and doable request as a possible strategy for meeting the unmet need. This 4-component process can be used in 2 ways: to honestly express ourselves or to empathetically hear others. For example, we could say, "When I see your unwashed dishes in the kitchen sink for more than 24 hours, observation, I feel sad and worried feelings because I value orderliness in the monastery. Need. So, would you be willing from now on to leave your dishes in the sink for no more than 1 hour before washing them? Request." Alternatively, the focus can be on the other person's feelings and needs instead of our own. For example, we could say, "I heard you speaking so loudly that I could hear from outside what you said about Father N, for example. Observation. Are you frustrated feeling because you want fair treatment? A need." In this example, the request is the question, asking if we understood him correctly. Our first guess at what the other person's feelings and needs are doesn't have to be correct. If it isn't, he will probably correct us immediately. What is important is that the focus of our dialogue is on his feelings and needs rather than on his opinions. In this manner, it is easy to connect with him because we're seeing the humanity in him without any judgments or viewing him as an enemy. An important point to be made is that this approach of dealing with undesired behavior is completely different from the typical approach. The typical way, whether in society, in a family, or even in a monastery, that we deal with the undesirable behavior of others is to try to correct it by pointing out to them what rules, laws, or norms they are transgressing. The problem with this typical approach is that it allows us to be disconnected with the deeper reasons why those rules were made in the first place. And from this disconnected state, it is all too easy to coldly show the other person how wrong he is, and often with an air of superiority and judgmentalism, without any vulnerability or human emotion except perhaps anger on our part. On the contrary, the approach of NVC protects us from falling into this legalistic approach by helping us to uncover the underlying principles and by helping us to reveal to the other person how we feel. This approach of transcending laws, which is what St. Sophronia of Essex implemented in his monastery, is certainly more difficult because it requires courage, honesty, and humility on our part. Yet these are virtues that keep us fully alive and transmit to others that same aliveness. The words of St. Paul would be appropriate here. Quote, "The letter of the law killeth, but the spirit of the law giveth life." 2 Corinthians 3:6. This is not to say that rules should be abolished or are not helpful for doing all things with orderliness, 1 Corinthians 14:40. But we must bear in mind the 3 inherent dangers of following rules instead of values. 1, They frequently lead to a resentful submission or even rebellion rather than the voluntary obedience envisioned by St. Pachomius and St. Basil the Great. 2, they rarely inspire intrinsic motivation. And 3, they tend to produce Pharisees. The Lord has said about people like the Pharisees, "This people draw nigh to me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching the commandments and doctrines of men." Mark chapter 7, verses 6 to 7, and Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13. After Christ's repeated attempts to teach the Jews to grasp the spirit of the law, it is a great tragedy when we Christians once again revert to legalism, merely replacing the Jewish laws with Christian laws. And it is an even greater tragedy when we monastics behave pharisaitically, as St. Maximus the Confessor observed happening in his day. Footnote: I hear the things that our Lord was saying to denounce the Pharisees to be referring to us, monastics, the present-day hypocrites, who have been counted worthy of so much grace, yet persist in things worse than them. End of quote, Maximus the Confessor. To continue. The following true story illustrates how an NVC approach can be used as a more effective option than resorting to laws, even when an appropriate law does exist. As I was driving one day through a small village, I was stopped by a policeman just after a bend in the road where I had absent-mindedly driven slightly across the center line. In a flash, seeing the policeman made me aware that I had been distracted and reactivated in me a long-standing rebelliousness against the stereotype of the blankety-blank cocky small-town cop. And clinging to this preconceived idea, I was expecting to be given the usual lecture. You've just broken rule number XYZ of the traffic code. The fine is 1,500 francs. That's the way it is. You have no choice. Or some similar moralizing discourse like, "Are you out of your mind driving like that in a village? Have you no sense?" I parked my car at the side of the road and waited with a rising sense of dread about what I knew would soon ensue. The policeman came up to me and greeted me very courteously. "Sir, I'm worried, feeling, because I'm in charge of safety, a need in this village when the children come out of school. When I see you driving across the center line, I'm not sure, a feeling, that you're aware of the risks, the need for the children who might be walking along this road or crossing it. How do you respond when I say that to you? A request." I almost asked him to repeat what he had said because I simply couldn't believe what I had just heard. This officer had observed a scenario without judging me. He was conveying to me his feeling, indicating to me his need, and requesting me to tell him how I felt. I marveled at the awareness of this man. He wasn't there to punish, to reprimand, or constrain, but to point out and remind me of a value and of a need: safety. He wasn't acting threateningly or punitively. He was inviting me to be responsible. Though I wanted to jump out of the car and give him a hug, I quietly answered him that I was embarrassed by my absent-mindedness, that the safety of people, and particularly the safety of children, was very close to my heart, and that his conscientiousness and responsible attitude was an invitation to me to become more aware, more responsible at the wheel. He wished me a good journey, and I drove off quite contented. I can assure you that this story still keeps me alert when I'm driving, much more so than if I'd been required to pay a fine, to buy a judiciary peace. This policeman, who might well have adopted a breakwater attitude, saying, for example, "You are in the wrong and you must pay," still comes to mind like a compassionate beacon, a marker I reflect on with respect and warm feelings, and that continues to urge me to greater watchfulness on the road. End of quote. From Thomas Ansenberg's Being Genuine. In the rest of this section on nonviolent communication, we shall elaborate on some important aspects of its 4 components and other issues. 1. Component 1. Observations. If we add an evaluation or a judgment to our factual observation, others are likely to hear it as criticism and become defensive and argumentative. Whereas when we translate judgments and interpretations into factual observations, it is easier to take responsibility for our reactions by directing our attention to our own needs as the source of our feelings rather than to the faults of the other person. Thus, such factual observations pave the way toward greater connection with ourselves and with others. Adding even a positive evaluation to our factual observation, saying, for example, "When you did that good thing," can detract from the connection, since our opinions about what is good depends on our own subjective preferences, background, and experiences, which may differ from that of the other person, opening up the door to misunderstandings. Rosenberg explained, quote, "NVC does not mandate that we remain completely objective and refrain from evaluating. It only requires that we maintain a separation between our observations and our evaluations. In an ongoing process of dialogue, there's often no need to mention either the observation, it is usually clear in the context of communication, or the request, since we may already acting on an assumed request for empathy." 2. Component 2. Feelings. In order to express a feeling in NVC, we usually use the phrase, "I feel," followed by an adjective, such as afraid or satisfied, anxious, etc. A common mistake made in trying to implement this method is to substitute thoughts for feelings by using the phrase, "I feel," followed by the words that, like, or a noun or pronoun, since the phrase, "I feel that," is synonymous with "I think that." It is evident that this phrase introduces a thought and not a feeling. For example, the statement, "I feel that the abbot should give more homilies," is not an expression of what the heart is feeling, but what the mind is thinking. Since understanding someone's opinions can only produce a shallow connection, whereas understanding someone's feelings and needs engenders a deep connection, NVC suggests that we focus on feelings and needs. The key to identifying and expressing feelings is to focus on words that describe our inner experience rather than words that describe our interpretations of people's actions. For example, "I feel lonely" describes an inner experience, whereas "I feel unloved by you" describes a mental interpretation of someone else's behavior. Many words ending in ed refer to an outside person or entity rather than the speaker, like abandoned, betrayed, or cheated, suggest blame for what someone else did, whereas the actual feelings of the speaker might be lonely, distraught, or resentful. Our feelings may be triggered by the actions and words of others, but not caused by them. Our feelings arise directly out of our experience of whether our needs seem to us to be met or unmet in a given circumstance. Our assessment of whether or not our needs are met almost invariably involves an interpretation or belief. When our needs are met, we may feel happy, satisfied, peaceful, and so forth. When our needs are not met, we may feel sad, scared, frustrated, etc. When we express our feelings, we continue the process of taking responsibility for our experience with less likelihood of others hearing criticism or blame of themselves. Thus, by expressing our unique experience in the moment of a shared human reality of needs, we create the most likely opportunity for another person to see our humanity and to experience empathy and understanding for us and respond in a way that meets both of our needs. A teacher of NVC made this important observation. Feelings are always related to your body and never involve others. All genuine feelings, such as fear, happiness, anxiety, surprise, and so forth, have been shown to have a direct effect resulting in specific sensation in particular places of our body. Although being unaware of these sensations requires that we have enough presence to sense our body. On the other hand, pseudo-feelings are cerebral and contain hidden interpretations and judgments of others. For example, when we say, "I feel abused, misunderstood, insulted, ignored, etc." What we're really saying is, I feel that, or i.e. I think that someone else has abused or misunderstood, insulted, and ignored me. These words show what we're thinking about other people's actions and how we interpret them rather than what we are directly feeling. That this is true can be demonstrated by the fact that someone who is ignored might feel relief rather than sorrow, depending on the situation and depending on his or her ability to view the situation from a different perspective. When discussing past events, focusing on one's feelings that are alive within oneself at the present moment about those past events is more helpful than bringing up feelings experienced in the past. Saint Sophronia of Essex had the same approach. As his niece related, quote, he always wanted us to tell him the current state of our lives. He did not want to hear about the past. He wanted to know about the present, what we were feeling. 3. Component 3, needs. It is important not to confuse strategies with needs. A need is always about oneself, not about another. In the context of NVC, a need is a basic human quality, such as a need for food, safety, meaning, understanding, love, etc. A strategy, on the other hand, typically involves specific people taking specific actions in order to fulfill one's needs. Referring to a specific person, location, action, time, or object is characteristic of a strategy rather than a fundamental human need. The key to identifying, expressing, and connecting with needs is to focus on words that describe shared human experience rather than words that describe the particular strategies to meet those needs. The internal shift from focusing on a specific strategy to connecting with underlying needs often results in a sense of liberation. We are encouraged to free ourselves from being attached to one particular strategy by identifying the underlying needs and exploring alternative strategies. Another liberating realization is that if all human behavior is merely an expression of needs, the only two things a person can ever really be saying, whether in words or actions, are please and thank you. A person says please with his words or actions when he wants a need of his to be met, and he says thank you with his words or actions when a need of his has been met. This paradigm for viewing human behavior is a powerful tool for engendering compassion because it transforms the way we view someone who is behaving selfishly or rudely or even violently. Although it can be challenging to identify needs accurately, it is more transformative than merely identifying feelings because it is when needs are identified that a deeper connection can take place, since all people share the same fundamental human needs. Our capacity for being at peace is not dependent on having our needs met. Even when many needs are unmet, meeting our need for self-connection can be sufficient for inner peace, especially when we have a deep relationship with Christ. Understanding, naming, and connection with our needs helps us improve our relationship with others, as well as fostering understanding with others, so we're all the more likely to take actions that meet everyone's needs. Being aware of our needs empowers us to separate stimulus from cause. That is, this approach gives us the clarity to see how another person's behavior may be a stimulus for my anger, but the actual cause of my anger lies within me. Separating stimulus from cause also frees us from the so-called, quote, guilt trips. That is, motivating others through guilt. For example, instead of saying, it disappoints me when you come late to church, we could say, when I see you miss church several times a week, observation, I feel concerned, a feeling, because I care for your spiritual well-being, a need. Do you share this concern of mine? It's a request. Honestly revealing our true feelings and admitting our needs sometimes requires great courage and humility, because this makes us vulnerable. Yet it is precisely this vulnerability that moves others to view us compassionately and motivates them to want to help us by finding a way for our needs to be met. They will be much more receptive to hearing a suggestion of ours regarding their behavior if we can express it in terms of how we personally feel about it and which needs of ours are not met because of their behavior, rather than in terms of how wrong we think their behavior is. Even if their behavior directly violates a biblical commandment or a patristic teaching, experience has shown that pointing this out to someone before establishing a compassionate connection with them it often leads to undesirable results. They may either become obstinate and seek to justify their actions, or they may resentfully submit, while increasing their bitterness toward us, and perhaps also even toward the author whose commandment we cited. 4. Component 4. Requests. In making a request, our aim is to identify and suggest a specific strategy or action that we believe will meet our needs and others' needs, and then check with others involved about their willingness to participate in meeting our needs in this way. In a given moment, it is our connection with another that determines the quality of their response to our request. Therefore, in the beginning stages of a dialogue using NVC, our first requests might be connection requests, intended to foster connection and understanding and to determine whether we have sufficiently connected before moving to a solution request. An example of a connection request might be, could you tell me what feelings this triggers in you? An example of a solution request might be, would you be willing to take off your shoes when you come in the house? One of the connection requests most necessary for achieving good communication is the feedback request, in order to ensure that we've been understood. This can take the form of the question, would you be willing to tell me what you heard me say? Footnote. Since we may hesitate to phrase this question in these words because it sounds unnatural, another way to verify that we have been understood is to ask, do you know what I mean? And if they reply affirmatively, then we can say something like, just so that I can be sure that you get what I'm saying, can you please tell me what you think I mean? Or, I'm not sure if I expressed myself clearly. Can you please tell me what you understood me saying? To continue. Another level of getting feedback would be to ask the other person how he thinks the conversation is going by saying something like, how are we doing with this conversation? Or, timeout, how are we doing resolving this issue? When making a solution request, it is most helpful to phrase it positively rather than negatively. For example, would you be willing to clean up your cell is more effective than, would you be willing to stop making a mess? Furthermore, the more specific a request is, the more likely we will get what we want, and the more likely the other person will be willing to comply. For example, would you be willing to hang up your clothes and throw away the plastic wrappers on the floor? Is more effective than just, would you be willing to clean up your cell? When our request is specific and doable, there's greater likelihood for achieving what we want. For example, if we request, I would like you to be more thoughtful. Even if the other person agrees to this, he might not know exactly what he should do differently. A much more specific and doable request would be, I would like you to ask me before taking tools from where I'm working. The most important thing to remember when making a request in NVC is not to demand compliance. A request is asking the other person to do something voluntarily, whereas a demand forces him either to submit or to rebel, and this approach can hinder connection. In other words, a request that is not a demand leaves the other person free to say yes or no. If we react to a refusal of our request by blaming, by insulting, laying a guilt trip, threatening, or punishing the person who refused to comply with it, it is clear that our request was actually a demand. This is where it is paramount to bear in mind that the goal of nonviolent communication is not compliance, but to achieve an honest, empathy-based relationship. Shifting from demands to requests entails a paradigm shift. We shift from trying to meet our own needs to trying to create a quality connection with the other person. Once this connection has been made, the result of this connection will be that both our needs and the other person's needs will matter to both of us. Then it will be easy to find a way for both people's needs to be met. When the other person sees that he has the freedom to respond negatively, we may not gain immediate assent to our wishes, but we're more likely to get our needs met over time, because we're building the trust that everyone's needs matter. Within an atmosphere of such trust, goodwill increases, altruism flourishes, and with it a willingness to support each other in getting our needs met. There are times in life, especially in hierarchical organizations, when a person with authority will choose to make a demand that is not merely a request. In such instances, the authority may still exhibit care for the feelings and needs of his subordinates. To avoid misunderstandings, the authority should make it clear to the subordinate that he is making a demand. But in the event that this is not done, it is beneficial if the subordinate asks for this clarification. When someone declines to comply with our request, this does not have to be the end of the dialogue. On the contrary, we can empathize with that negative response by guessing what needs of his are preventing him from complying. After he has received sufficient empathy, he will be able to hear our own feelings and needs, which we could express by saying, for example, I am disappointed because I was hoping that you would want to contribute to the orderliness of the holy monastery. And adding the request, would you be willing to clean your cell as soon as you finish the section of the book you're reading? Or even, can you think of a solution that would meet both of our needs? Experience has shown repeatedly that once both parties have succeeded in fully understanding each other's needs, then from that point, it is easy to find a mutually satisfactory solution. Through nonviolent communication, we're seeking a win-win resolution in which everyone is intrinsically motivated by the joy inherent in compassionate giving rather than by extrinsic motivators, such as punishments and rewards. If a person is doing something merely because of a punishment or a reward, he'll probably stop doing it as soon as we're not present to give the punishment or reward. Moreover, if someone agrees to our request merely out of fear, guilt, shame, obligation, or the desire for a reward, this compromises the quality of connection and trust between him and us. Since people do not always express all their feelings verbally, it is important for us to pay attention to nonverbal cues that can reveal that their agreement is not wholehearted. 5. Empathy in nonviolent communication. Empathy is central in NVC, and the key ingredient for empathy is presence, according to Rosenberg. This involves being in the present moment and aware of one's body, since feelings have a bodily manifestation. It is a non-judgmental state in which one observes oneself and notes as well what the other person is observing, feeling, needing, and requesting. This kind of watchfulness and presence is the opposite of our habitual state of waking sleep, in which we float through our day like automatons, mindlessly reacting to whatever circumstances and people come our way as if on autopilot. Moreover, Rosenberg emphasized that people need not just our empathy, but empathy in conjunction with our honesty. The principles of nonviolent communication are also useful for silently communicating with ourselves, that is, for dealing internally with a situation. This means listening through any interpretations and judgments of ourselves that we're making in order to clarify how we're feeling and what we are needing. For example, when we are angry, NVC can be used to identify our unmet needs. Once they've been identified, the anger invariably transforms into another feeling, such as sorrow or fear, that will help us deal with the situation productively rather than destructively. This is why Rosenberg defines anger as a tragic expression of an unmet need. Since anger is a result of thoughts of blame and judgment, it is caused by being in the head, whereas when we are connected with our feelings and our needs, we are in the heart, which is what transforms the anger into a different feeling. This is much more beneficial and more psychologically and spiritually healthy than reacting violently out of anger or repressing it, which invariably leads to physical and psychological symptoms. Footnote: a clinical psychologist observed, where there is repressed anger, not only will there be a symptom, there must be a symptom. From a book, The Psychoanalysis of Evil, Perspectives on Destructive Behavior. To continue, the process of nonviolent communication enables us to hear others empathetically by perceiving the feelings and needs behind their expressions and actions, regardless of how they express themselves, even if their expression or actions includes judgments, demands, and physical violence. This entails translating their violent words or actions into an expression of their unmet needs, and their corresponding feelings. Empathetic connection can happen silently, but in times of conflict, verbally communicating to another person that we understand their feelings and that their needs matter to us can be a powerful turning point in difficult situations. Demonstrating our understanding of their needs does not mean that we are sacrificing our own needs or pretending that we're not in pain because of their violent words or actions. It is merely a temporary shift of our focus from our needs to theirs. Implementing the process of nonviolent communication during a dialogue typically consists of switching between three modes of expression. 1, giving empathy to the other person by guessing their feelings and needs, usually followed by a connection request. Did I understand you? 2, honestly expressing one's own feelings and needs to the other person, often followed by a connection request. Do you understand me? And 3, giving oneself empathy by silently reconnecting with one's own feelings and needs. This is especially necessary when anger and guilt or shame is triggered in us by something the other person said. NVC can be used successfully even when the other person is ignorant of its principles and methods. And this is because if we have the inner strength and presence of mind to remain in an empathetic state by reflecting back to the other person what his feelings and needs are, while respecting his autonomy, the other person will invariably be touched by this. This increases his own capacity for compassion for himself and for us, thus greatly increasing the likelihood that both his and our needs will be met peacefully. Granted, this might not happen during the first few exchanges of words. The more empathy the other person needs, the longer it will take in the conversation before his needs for being understood will be met, rendering him ready to listen to our own feelings and needs. Rosenberg warned that this 4-component method is not meant to be implemented robotically. He explained, the essence of NVC is to be found in our consciousness of these 4 components, not in the actual words that are exchanged. He emphasized that the most important aspect of this method is that we put ourselves into the frame of mind of wanting to connect with the other person, not on the level of mental agreement regarding particular strategies for fulfilling needs, but on the level of the heart, by empathizing with each other's feelings and being aware of each other's needs. This method will fail if we try to take advantage of it merely as a trick to get our own way. We need to be aware that its purpose is not to make the other person conform to our will. On the contrary, Rosenberg taught that it is a tool to facilitate an empathetic connection with the other person in a way that enables compassionate giving to take place. It's giving that comes from the heart willingly, where we are giving service to ourselves and others, not out of duty, obligation, nor out of fear or punishment, hope for a reward, not out of guilt or shame, but for what I consider is our nature to enjoy giving to one another. Through its emphasis on deep listening to ourselves as well as others, NVC fosters respect, attentiveness, and empathy, and engenders a mutual desire to give from the heart. Experience has shown over and over again that once an empathetic connection has been made at the level of feelings and needs, a transformation happens in which one or both people experience a shift in attention. This can lead to a shift of needs or generate new reserves of kindness and generosity. As a result, both people will naturally work together to find a solution that meets everyone's needs. Not only that, but the solution that arises will typically be found in only a few minutes. Not in a few minutes from the time the dialogue began, but from the time both sides have fully grasped each other's needs. This happens naturally because we human beings inherently enjoy contributing to the well-being of others. Once we have connected with our own and others' needs and can experience our giving as coming from choice. The 4-component method of NVC often helps us relate to others, but the crux of its success lies in our ability to connect compassionately with our own and with others' humanity. Since the inner intent is the most important aspect of this method, its 4-component process is not even necessary when our heart is in the right place. Besides, if we were always able to express ourselves using this 4-component process, Others could interpret this as artificial way of speaking as a lack of sincerity and honesty, which is the exact opposite of what is intended. While the formal format of nonviolent communication is designed to help us focus our consciousness at the level of the heart, an informal approach with more casual words, or even wordlessly through the look on our face or through our body language, can achieve that very same connection. 6. Apologies and gratitude. Nonviolent communication enables us to do something much deeper than just apologize, but rather to share our mourning with someone who we have offended. Rosenberg explained, apology is based on moralistic judgment, that what I did was wrong and I should suffer for it. Well, that's radically different from mourning, which is based on life-serving judgments. Did I meet my own needs? No. Then what need didn't I meet? When we are in touch with our unmet need, we never feel shame nor guilt, self-anger, or the depression that we feel when we think that what we did was wrong. We feel sadness, deep sadness, and sometimes frustration, but never depression, guilt, anger, or shame. These 4 feelings tell us we're making moralistic judgments at the moment we are feeling those feelings. End of quote. Thus, instead of apologizing, we could express our mourning in this manner. Father, when I see how my actions have contributed to your pain, observation, I feel very sad, feeling. I care for you, and it is important to me that I support your need. Please forgive me, request. It goes without saying that this kind of message will touch someone much more deeply than a heartfelt, I'm sorry. The NVC process also enables us to express gratitude to others in a way that they will appreciate much more than by praising them or by simply saying thank you. It consists of the same 4 components of NVC, observation, feeling, need, request, but without the request, since we have no requests when we're grateful and our needs have been met. In other words, we first mention precisely what the other person did, then we honestly say how this made us feel, and finally we express what need of ours was met. For example, we could say, when you sacrificed your time in order to listen to me, observation, I was relieved and touched, feelings, because I really needed some understanding. That was the need for what I've been going through. One point that Rosenberg failed to make is that this method of expressing apologies and gratitude can be used even in the way we speak to God as a way of repenting and glorifying Him. For example, we could say, Lord, when I consider how often I neglect to pray to Thee, observation, I feel deep regret and sorrow, feelings, because I desperately need connection and communion with Thee, who art the source of life and joy and peace, needs. Have mercy on me and forgive me, request. It's worth asking ourselves how this kind of repentance could affect our souls differently than repentance in which we might callously state, forgive me, Lord, I skipped my prayer rule several times. As for expressing gratitude to God, one could say, for example, as I witness the beauty of creation out in the forest, observation, I'm overcome with awe and amazement, feelings, at the magnificence of thy works, and it brings me great peace to appreciate such exquisite beauty, needs. A nun once confessed to me that when she tried expressing her gratitude to God using the method of NVC, she was moved to the point of tears. 7. Other applications of nonviolent communication. Rosenberg taught, nonviolent communication is designed to help us remain conscious of choice at every moment. By viewing situations through the prism of NVC, we become more aware of our needs and deeper values. Having connected with these needs, we can then consciously choose to meet them, regardless of how unpleasant the circumstances may be. For example, when we're doing a task we dislike, rather than doing it out of a sense of forced obligation, we can be at peace with the situation by telling ourselves, I choose to do this unpleasant thing because I want such and such benefit, or because I value such and such principle, such as the principle of cooperation, or cutting off my will out of the love for Christ or love for my brother. Instead of saying, like it or not, I have to do it, or should do this unpleasant thing, period. Hearing the word should from within or from somebody else takes all the joy out of doing a task. As Elder Emilianos said, the word must or should has never moved anyone to do anything. On the contrary, it makes you feel like a slave and discourages you from moving forward. The force of must moves neither God nor the heart and is something that unravels and comes apart very easily. End of footnote from The Way of the Spirit, Reflections on Life and God, page 5. To continue, expressing ourselves through NVC helps us to avoid labeling people, which depersonalizes them and breaks the commandments of Christ. Judge not. Matthew 7:1. For example, instead of muttering to ourselves, that person is lazy, we could say, I'm feeling frustrated, because I value cooperation, need, and he's been sitting in the garden for 3 hours, observation. Furthermore, labeling is dangerous because it not only places a person within a limiting box, but it can also serve to perpetuate a harmful behavior. For example, if I tell myself, I'm just a glutton, I may come to believe that this passion is an integral part of my being, and thereby abandon trying to resist it. When receiving criticism, rather than retaliating, with a counterattack that can be verbal, physical, or only in thoughts, we can instead use the principles of NVC either to sense our own feelings and needs or to sense the other person's feelings and needs that produced his criticism. Rosenberg said, no matter what words people use to express themselves, we listen for their observations, feelings, and needs, and what they're requesting to enrich life. When this is done out of a sincere attempt to connect with the other person, it inevitably leads to constructive results. Likewise, when someone orders us to do something unpleasant, instead of rebelling or resentfully submitting, we can choose to connect with the other person's needs empathetically and then voluntarily obey. Viewing other people's criticism, insults, and judgments through the lens of nonviolent communication enables us to receive their otherwise hurtful words without being wounded or viewing them as enemies, because we're able to see that they are simply fellow human beings with unmet needs. Their strong words can even give us joy because we can see how those words as an opportunity to show them compassion and find a way to satisfy their unmet needs. Although all communications could be expressed using the 4-component process of NVC, this is not necessary. It is primarily our emotionally charged messages that are worth phrasing in such language, not only for the benefit of others, but even for our own benefit. It is in times of conflict or reactivity to others that NVC is most needed in order to transform our disconnected state of being and return us to our compassionate intention and our attention to the present. With practice, many people have found that using NVC to empathize silently with themselves is sufficient by itself to resolve inner conflicts and conflicts with others, as it transforms our experience of life. 8. Drawbacks and limitations of NVC. A serious block to communication can be a lack of time. If the 2 or more people have not allotted enough time to communicate, they're likely to fail to connect at a satisfactorily deep level. Context is also important. Trying to communicate with someone on a serious matter while simultaneously doing some other task is likely to be less effective than trying to do so when both people have little to distract them. One seeming drawback of NVC is that it appears to require more time to communicate with this method than with our habitual manner of communication. It is only a seeming drawback, however, because the extra time spent for using NVC is far outweighed by all the time typically wasted when poor communication results in conflicts, many of which can last for years, not to mention all the stress and disturbing thoughts that accompany serious conflicts. A real drawback of NVC, or rather a real challenge of NVC, is that despite the method's simplicity, it is very challenging to implement. Not only can it require a great deal of presence to fathom what we or others are even feeling, and needing when emotions are complex, but it can also require a great deal of humility to admit our feelings and needs, especially if our culture teaches us that we shouldn't have certain needs. Another challenge is that it is precisely the times when we need NVC the most, when our feelings have intense negative emotions, that it is also the most difficult to think clearly and calmly enough to implement the principles of NVC. Since the success of NVC depends on the ability to empathize, it may be ineffective when used with people whose defense mechanisms have drastically diminished their capacity for empathy. People suffering from personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, may maintain a psychological structure that challenges them in the area of empathy. Furthermore, those known as psychopaths or sociopaths may even be biologically incapable of empathy. God forbid. 9. NVC and orthodoxy. While the psychology advocated by NVC is in line with Christian ethics, that is, NVC empathizes with virtues such as love, patience, honesty, peacefulness, and so forth, a few ontological implications of NVC ought to be clarified before they could be considered Christian. For example, Rosenberg suggests that we avoid referring to moral absolutes, such as right, wrong, good, and bad, because they enable us to express ourselves impersonally without revealing what is going on inside ourselves, which inhibits other people from connecting with us. Perhaps Rosenberg's personal belief was that such moral absolutes do not even exist. We, as Orthodox Christians, however, can still maintain our belief in the existence of good and evil and sin while implementing NVC, simply by not using this framework to appoint ourselves as the judges of how right or wrong or sinful we think someone else or his actions are. Instead, we may focus on fundamental human needs and leave the judgment to God. Besides, in the original Judeo-Christian understanding, sin is not a moral infraction, but missing the mark of God's will and love. Another example of Rosenberg's teachings that at first glance may appear to conflict with orthodoxy is his critical stance toward self-reproach. On the one hand, the prayers of the Holy Fathers and the Church's hymnography are full of belittling expressions of self-reproach. Rosenberg, however, discourages self-admonishment because it leads to destructive shame or guilt. Nevertheless, upon examining more carefully what Rosenberg and the Holy Fathers are really saying, it becomes clear that their approaches do not conflict because they're talking about two different kinds of self-reproach. On the one hand, Rosenberg is pointing out the harm of unhealthy self-reproach that leads to what St. Paul called worldly sorrow, whereas the Holy Fathers promoted healthy self-reproach, which leads to godly sorrow. As St. Paul wrote, quote, "Godly sorrow produces a repentance without regret, leading to salvation, but worldly sorrow produces death." 2 Corinthians 7:10. The Holy Fathers also use the term joy-making sorrow to describe godly sorrow. St. John Cassian explained the important difference between these two kinds of sorrow as follows, from the Ladder of Divine Ascent, Step 7. Godly sorrow, nourishing the soul with the hope given by repentance, is mixed with joy. Therefore it renders man eager and obedient with reference to every good work, accessible, humble, gentle, forbearing, and patient in enduring all the suffering or tribulation God may send us. From this are known the fruits of the Holy Spirit in man, namely joy, love, peace, long-suffering, goodness, faith, self-restraint, Galatians 5:22. But from the opposite kind of sorrow, we come to know the fruits of the evil spirit, which are despondency, impatience, anger, hatred, objection, despair, and laziness with regard to prayer. We should avoid this kind of sorrow. End of quote. Thus, healthy self-reproach springs from a tender awareness that we've grieved God and or our neighbor, both of whom we want to love. To express this in NVC terminology, we would say that connecting with our need to love God and our neighbor while recalling our actions that failed to meet this need of ours elicits feelings not of shame and guilt, but of some kind of grief that mobilizes us to repent. Healthy self-reproach does not lead to despair because we have faith that God loves and forgives us. This is the kind of self-reproach that the Lord taught St. Silouan the Athonite. Keep thy mind in hell and despair not. Unhealthy self-reproach, however, springs from an egocentric, worldly sorrow when we see that the idol of our self-image has been shattered. Unhealthy self-reproach is often fostered by a legalistic, non-orthodox understanding of sin as a mere breaking of a rule, rather than by the orthodox understanding of sin as missing the mark. Because unhealthy self-reproach is rooted in pride and self-love, and is steeped in worldly sorrow, it produces death, namely depression and despair. It is only this unhealthy self-reproach that Rosenberg rightly denounces as joyless and ineffective. Yet by not explaining thoroughly enough in his book that there is also a healthy kind of self-reproach, as promoted by the Holy Fathers, some readers may assume that NVC discourages all kinds of self-reproach. Thus, although there is nothing unacceptable in the NVC approach to self-reproach, it lacks the spiritual depth found in the Holy Father's understanding of self-reproach. This is to be expected, since NVC presents merely a helpful psychology without attempting to present a correct ontology of the uncreated, as is found only in the Orthodox faith. Orthodoxy begins with a distinct ontology preserved by the Holy Fathers in the councils of the Church, which is different than that which undergirds heterodox literature. As long as this is recognized, an appropriate discernment is made. Science and psychology and nonviolent communication are able to contribute in a variety of ways. Footnote: the role that contemporary psychological methods such as NVC can play in the spiritual life of an Orthodox Christian is a complex and controversial topic that we shall not attempt to address here. Suffice it to say, however, that we agree with the following stance of the elder Antonios Romeos of Grigoriou Monastery on the Holy Mountain, quote, I accept any anthropological science that aids human self-knowledge because essentially this greatly assists in the work of pastoral theology, since it creates the most correct dynamic for receiving the grace of God. I never believed that there should be a predisposition such as this kind, which some of our beloved fellow clergymen have, who, as a matter of principle and of the faith, reject the considerable contribution of psychology or psychiatry. Of course, I do not accept nor adopt, nor am I unaware of the theoretical, clinical, and practical mistakes that these sciences can make. End of quote. Bearing in mind what limitations NVC has in regards to our spiritual life will help us keep NVC and all psychology in general in perspective. The primary spiritual limitations of NVC are as follows. It presents a humanistic approach to living virtuously that fails to include crucial aspects of the Christian life, such as the need for divine grace, for prayer, and faith. NVC also overlooks the influence of God's grace and the reality of demonic influences. Furthermore, in Christianity, we often choose to sacrifice our own needs out of love for God and for our neighbor, thus transcending NVC's approach of trying to meet everyone's needs. Moreover, NVC by itself does not lead to salvation and theosis. These shortcomings of NVC are not problematic for us Orthodox Christians as long as we bear in mind that its role is not to replace Orthodox spirituality but to complement it. That is, NVC certainly can be used in conjunction with the ascetical approach of living the spiritual life in an Orthodox manner, because it is essentially a tool that enables people to express the compassion that they otherwise might have failed to access without NVC's method. A living saint would probably have little need for learning any of this method of NVC, since Christ, who is love, lives in him. Galatians 2:20. And thus a saint would already be at a level at which he constantly expresses himself compassionately. As for the rest of us who have not yet attained to that level, we could undoubtedly benefit from methods such as NVC until by God's grace and our spiritual struggle we become a perfect man unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Ephesians 4:13. Monastic behavior continued. 14. Helping others. The Holy Fathers attached utmost importance to brotherly love. Abba John the Dwarf said, "It is not possible to build a house from the top down. One must build it from the foundation to the top." "What does this saying mean?" his disciples asked him. The Yerunde replied, "The foundation is your neighbor, whom you must win over to Christ by your love. And this must be done first, for on him depend all the commandments of Christ." As St. Anthony put it, life and death depend on our neighbor. For if we win over our brother, we win over God. But if we offend our brother, we sin against Christ. Elder Emilianos wrote for his nuns, "The touchstone of authenticity for the sisters shall be the love they bear toward the others, which is what the Lord requires above all else. The heart of each shall be open, full of simplicity, sincerity, and affection, admitting all the others, with love that is deep, strong, manly, and spiritual." From the Authentic Seal, Emilianos, page 147. St. Euthemios taught, "If your brother calls you while you're occupied with your manual work, make haste to see what he wants and work with him, leaving aside your own work." Elder Ephraim also taught us the same thing, but added that we should refuse to help only if, in doing so, we would have to neglect what we're under obedience to complete. In such a case, we should explain to him which responsibilities of ours are preventing us from helping him. And if we truly love our brother as ourselves, and want to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, Luke 6:31, the way in which we refuse to help will be full of commiseration and sorrowful apology for being unable to help, rather than an attitude of, "That's your problem, not mine," which, needless to say, should never be said by a Christian, and especially not by a monk, and even more so, not by a monk in a cenobium where all things are shared in common. Saint Sophronia of Essex instilled this sense of commonality in his brotherhood. He told them, quote, "Monasticism, with the principle of obedience, makes man capable of embracing everyone with his love. So this is what we ought to preserve in our monastery. I pray continually that each of us will acquire the consciousness that this small monastic family is my life, and the sufferings or illnesses of any one of us at all are really the common illness of us all." I was amazed that John the theologian, in his description of the mystical supper of Christ, says that the Lord gave a new commandment to the apostles: love one another. John 13:34. So each one of us in monasticism should set as a primary goal to experience our brotherhood as a single human being. End of quote, St. Sophrony. It is easy to forget this elementary principle of demonstrating brotherly love, as we see in the sayings of the Desert Fathers. A brother asked an elder, "How is it that some struggle in their way of life and yet do not receive the grace that the fathers of old received?" The elder replied, "Back then there was love, and each one drew his neighbor upwards, but now that love has grown cold, each one drags his neighbor downwards. This is why we do not receive grace." Evangelinos, Book 3, page 291. Another aspect of brotherly love entails caring for the sick. St. Walworth wrote in his Rule for the Nuns, "Those who are bound by infirmity should be cared for, following the model the author declares when he says, 'Whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them.' Matthew 7:12. Though this might be applied to all, it is shown particularly in the infirmary, because the Lord said, 'I was sick and you visited me.' Matthew 25:36. Therefore, the sick should be cared for as though Christ were receiving the same ministrations in person. Therefore, revere anyone who devotes care to the sick for Christ, for she ministers to Christ in the sick. And let it be the care of the abbess that they have a separate cell with every convenience, that she spare no external labor which might save pain to those who are sick in body. and if the time as the Lenten season demands that the others change their lives, exception is always made for the sick, that they shall be served food as well as drink generously. The use of the baths or the best medical care is introduced. This is conceded reluctantly to the healthy, particularly the young. The abbess should take such care of the sick as she hopes to receive from the Lord. The rule of St. Abel explains the spirit of self-sacrifice that should prevail in a holy monastery. When, through obedience, they go to carry out their duties, let their spirit be, "This is a heavy task, brother. Let me do it." With this mindset, monks in the old days would argue in order to bear the burden of doing extra work for themselves, for example, among the Desert Fathers. There was a certain solitary who had another solitary as his disciple. The latter lived in a cell 10 miles away from him. One day his thoughts said to him, "Summon the brother to come here and receive his bread." But then he reflected, "Am I going to make my brother trek 10 miles for the sake of bread? No, I will take the bread to him myself." So he took the bread and set off to visit his disciple. While on his way, an angel appeared before him, saying, "The very steps that you take for the sake of the Lord are counted and are reckoned worthy of a great reward in the sight of God." Then, giving thanks to God for the words of the angel, the ascetic went on his way rejoicing. He arrived at the brother's cell, bearing the loaves of bread, and recounted to him the love for mankind that God had shown to him. After giving him the bread, he returned to his own cell. On the following day, he again took some loaves of bread and went to visit another monk. It so happened that the latter was coming toward him at the same time for the same purpose, and they met each other along the way. The one who was going said to the one who was coming, "I had a treasure, and you sought to rob me of it." The other monk replied to him, "Does the narrow gate have room only for you? Allow me to enter it together with you." And at once, as they were speaking, an angel of the Lord appeared to them and said, "This quarrel of yours has ascended to God as an odor of sweet savor." Evangelinos, Book 3, page 297. St. Silouan showed by example that we ought to do what people ask of us, even if there is no particular personal benefit in doing so. To quote from St. Silouan the Athonite, page 59. One feast day, when Father Benjamin of Caligra and Father Silouan were walking through the monastery woods, Father Benjamin suggested that they should go and see Father Ambrosios, a remarkable and well-known starets, who was then confessor to the Bulgarian monastery of Zografu. Silouan agreed at once, and they set off. Father Benjamin was curious to know what Silouan would ask of the starets. "I'm not thinking of asking him anything," replied Silouan. "I have no problems at the moment." "Then why are you coming?" "Because you wanted me to." "Yes, but people go to a starets for the sake of edification." "I'm subduing my will to yours, and that is of greater benefit to me than any advice from the starets." A complication in implementing this kind of brotherly love, though, occurs when a Martha habitually tries to get a Mary to help her out. On the one hand, since the Lord clearly said that Mary has chosen the better portion, Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42, it seems that it would be a mistake for Mary to leave the one thing needful in order to help out Martha with the work. On the other hand, however, St. John Cassian praised the monks of Egypt for putting obedience to others above all other virtues. Quote from the Institutes, "When they're seated in their rooms and devoting their energies to both work and meditation, and they hear the sound of someone knocking at the door and striking at the cells of different ones, calling them to prayer or to some kind of work, they immediately rush out of their rooms. The one in his room is striving with all his energy and zeal to pursue the virtue of obedience. It is this that they prefer, not only to manual labor or to reading or to the peace and quiet of their cells, but even to all other virtues, such that they judge everything else as negligible in comparison with it, and are content to undergo any loss whatsoever as long as they do not violate this good in any respect." Similarly, St. Ephrem of Katanakia found out the hard way that one can lose grace even by justifiably refusing to help a brother. The justification being that one is in the good state of prayer and does not want to lose it, as he himself related, quote, I remember one time I went to my cell to pray a bit. In fact, I found myself in a grace-filled state of prayer. Suddenly, my brother monk, Procopius, came and knocked on the door, saying, Papa, the fire for the food has gone out. I thought to myself, now that I'm in the midst of the activity of grace, let's savor the joy, and when the sensation of grace has finished, then I'll go tend to the work. I'll go in just a little while to take care of it, I told him. I didn't have time to finish my words before grace had left me. Wasn't that disobedience? I was disobedient and set forth my own opinions, even though Father Procopius wasn't the elder, but my brother. Then I reprimanded myself. Wretch, you were disobedient and lost grace as well. That's why I say be obedient, and you will find prayer. Don't look at prayer, because prayer itself depends on obedience. From Obedience's Life, Elder Ephraim of Katanakia, page 118. Thus, St. Simeon the New Theologian taught his monks, do not make your longing for prayer a pretext for turning away from anyone who asks for your help. For love is greater than prayer. Although we should be eager to help others, we ourselves should avoid burdening others by asking them for help unnecessarily. As Thomas Jefferson put it, never trouble another for what you can do yourself.